So thank you for joining us tonight for this Wonder Hour. As we go throughout the presentation night, feel free to ask questions and interrupt us if you want. You can use the chat function within Zoom. I will use that to monitor your questions, or you can unmute yourself and ask your question live as well. And if something happens, you have to walk away and you miss part of the presentation, a recording will be shared with everyone as soon as it's live and ready to be shared. I'll email that out with everyone. So first, I'll start by talking a little bit more about us. So it's easiest to understand Great River Greening in its simplest form. We take the bad and make it beautiful. So we transform threatened natural areas, those overrun by invasive species, erosion, and suffering in response to our changing climate, into healthy, resilient ecosystems. With the top of the ecologists in the region on our team, Great River Greening protects Minnesota's waterways, restores our public parks and lakes, sustains native wildlife, and pushes the needle towards a more sustainable model for agriculture. We make and keep Minnesota beautiful. If you hike in regional parks, bring your family to local lakes, or cycle along the river, you've probably seen our work and not even known it. We've touched more than 400 parks and lakes across the state. Another way to understand us is by understanding what we don't do and how we're different. So Great River Greening doesn't participate in advocacy or land acquisition. We have partners that do that work. Instead, we do the actual restoration work, getting our hands dirty, planting trees, removing invasives, reviving shorelines, and finding natural solutions to environmental problems. And we do it all with thousands of volunteers, including kids and teens, by our side. So tonight, we'll be talking about spring ephemerals. So I thought it would be interesting to highlight some of our Great River Greening project sites where you might see some of these. So one that our ecologist mentioned was Carroll's Woods in Rosemount, Minnesota. In 2019, we cleared out buckthorn and opened up the woods. And we worked with the Rosemount High School and community members to do this work. And last spring, the forest floor was covered in Jack in the Pulpit. And some of the partners there in Dakota County thought it was the first time that they'd seen Jack in the Pulpit on the forest floor in more than a decade. Another park is the Catherine Abbott Park in Matabidi, Minnesota. We did similar work there, pulling buckthorn and other invasives out and opening up, which increased the sun on the forest floor. And now you can see spring ephemerals all along the paths. And then just today, I got a text message from our ecologist, Becca Tucker, of a picture of bloodroot that she had seen at Valley Park today. And Valley Park is in Mendota Heights. And this is an interesting project because in partnership with Xcel Energy, we're cleaning out and planting natives underneath their power lines there in the park. And right under the power lines, as she was there checking the site, she saw a spring ephemeral. At the end of the presentation, we'll share a list of other project sites and places you might see spring ephemerals. Now, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our speakers. So we have Kathy Marquardt tonight here with us, who is coming to us during a visit to her family in Seattle. So I appreciate her taking the time tonight. She's a retired biochemist and a current Great River Greening volunteer supervisor. Along with Kathy, Aiden Reed is here. He's a graduate student at the University of Minnesota in natural resources, and also a Great River Greening volunteer supervisor. And I'd be remiss if I didn't plug that there are volunteer opportunities this spring where you could hang out with Kathy and Aiden and do work, or you could become a volunteer supervisor yourself. There's more information about that on the Great River Greening website. And tonight, together, Kathy and Aiden will share their knowledge and fondness for spring ephemerals. And just a reminder that feel free to interrupt us with questions throughout the presentation. So since Kathy, Aiden, and myself are not trained botanists, I looked up the definition of what is a spring ephemeral just to get us started. So the internet tells me an ephemeral plant is one marked by short life cycles. And that was a little vague. So I asked our ecologist to describe it to me. And so their cumulative answer is, this is what they said. Springer ephemerals are plants that during most of the growing season are shaded out by the dense canopy of deciduous trees. Because they get very little sunlight during this time, they try to get their whole life cycle done before the trees leaf out. Before leaves appear, they're taking up sunlight, growing, and reproducing. By midsummer, you may not even know what that the plants are there, but the roots and seeds are in the soil. So with that, I will turn the program over to Kathy.
Are we going to have our first pictures?
There you go.
All right. So the earliest flower / plant that I see every year in early to mid-March is the skunk cabbage. And here's a picture that I took in 9 Mile Creek in Bloomington. The purplish brown spathe and then inside is the reproductive parts. The yellow is the technically the flower. And you can see how difficult it is to see because it really blends in with its surroundings, which is often very wet, muddy, even flowing water and puddles. The green spike you see is going to turn into very large green leaves that are 2 to 3 feet tall, smooth, sort of ovoid, and look nothing like and totally hide this maroon colored reproductive part. The leaves are not going to grow and develop until they the pollination has occurred. The reason that it has the name of skunk cabbage, it doesn't really smell like a skunk. If you break a leaf, it will have a putrid odor, but they think that's an important part of attracting the insects and pollinators. It also has a process called thermogenesis, heat producing, probably helps melt the snow around it, and probably attracts the insects also, and maybe gives them some protection from the freezing weather that would still be occurring. So supposedly, doing a little more research, these closed brownish maroon spathes are actually visible in late summer, early fall, when the green leaves die down, but they're closed because there's not going to be any pollination until spring. I've never looked for them, so this year that's on my to-do list. So you find these in very wet, even slow-moving spring streams. So you might have to get muddy feet if you want to get a picture of them like I did. And I found these in 9 Mile Creek between 106th Street on the gravel path that goes down to the river, Minnesota River. So that's all I have for the.
Yeah.
And hi everybody, I'm Aiden. Just to add to Kathy's a little bit, I saw just an enormous amount of skunk cabbage. I live in South Minneapolis, just an enormous number of skunk cabbage on the Minnehaha Creek Trail, just down by the creek by the falls, just enormous amount. And I don't think Kathy emphasized enough how crazy that thermogenic process is. I don't know how exactly it works. I imagine it's a similar process to actually how mammals generate heat, but that's just a pretty unique thing that those plants can do. So then just moving to the plant I have selected here, this is the Minnesota dwarf trout lily, which is one of my favorites. I was lucky enough to grow up in Nerstrand, Minnesota, right next to the Nerstrand Big Wood State Park. And I had no idea that this is an incredibly rare plant that's pretty much only found, I think it's 2 or 3 counties in the southern part of the state. So less than 700 acres in the entire world have this particular plant on it. So it's obviously pretty unique. And it's all just, it's, you know, an hour's drive from the city. So it's a fairly accessible plant that you can still see. Just skip to the next slide, please. So
Sorry.
this is yeah, no problem. So this is the Minnesota dwarf trout lily, and it's similar in appearance to some of the other lilies you might be able to see. But it's obviously it's going to be smaller and it has more of a pinkish color as opposed to the white lily, which is the one that it most kind of resembles. But like I said, one of the more defining features of it is that it's incredibly rare. So if you're seeing them, you're probably somewhere that likely has a sign describing what they are. So my favorite spot to find them is obviously the Nurse Strand Big Wood State Park. That's the spot that I recommend. Beyond that, I'm not sure. There are other spots near Faribault. Um, I know there's some scientific and natural areas owned by the state, but beyond that, I'm not sure exactly where to find it. But it is an endangered species. Like I said, it's only 600 acres of habitat. And one of the reasons why it's so rare is because it only reproduces via bulbs. So it's got this root structure, and they'll send out runners, which will basically form a new bulb, and then that plant will then germinate from that bulb. Um, there's a lot of debate about whether they can reproduce via seeds or not. Um, there's no consensus right now. It's thought that it probably happens, or you just have never seen it happen, like a lot of things in nature. And if you were to go down to Nurse Strand today, I do not think you would probably see this one. In my experience, it's usually I think that region of the state is a little behind some of the other southern areas. So I would look in early May for this one, if I recall correctly. But it is a fairly early plant, so you might be able to see it now, but I would wait a few weeks. And that's all I've got for this one, Meredith.
Yeah.
I guess one other cool feature I would point out was you can see kind of the speckles on its leaves. Kind of, I'm not quite sure how to describe that, but that's another defining feature for this plant.
And more common is the larger trout lily that grows overlapping, and but the one that he has pictured here is very tiny and very special. So now we're going to go on to posque flowers, and those are always the second flower I see. Very close. This picture was taken very close in 9 Mile Creek to where the skunk cabbage picture was taken, and it is up on a little piece of goat prairie up on the bluff. So it's high and dry. I think technically, because it's a prairie plant, it wouldn't be called a spring ephemeral, but I am giving a very broad, very early spring wildflowers is part of my definition for spring ephemerals in this presentation. So you can see it comes up, the buds and the stems are covered in this dense, very fine, furry hairs that are almost like they're carrying their own little blanket or jacket as they emerge. It's always on a prairie slope. Typically it faces southwest, so that's how it's getting that intense spring sun at the end of winter, in fact. And it's about, when they're fully open, this violet leaf or flower is about an inch or so across, and it just has that intense yellow, dense center. It's very distinct. You can see the prairie grasses that it's poked through. The basal leaves, you see no leaves here yet. When seeds are forming, that is about the time that the basal leaves will come out, and then the stems usually grow quite a bit taller, and the seeds are kind of these long, hairy looking things. And I didn't have a good enough picture to have, I'm always on to some other wildflowers at that point, so I didn't take good pictures of this, the foliage that you'll see. And like I said, I always see them first on a little piece of goat prairie up on the bluff above 9 Mile Creek, very close to 106th Street. I think people kind of call it Posque Hill. And but any prairie, sandier soil area can have them. So I see them in plenty of other places also. It's just my go-to spot early. And I saw them last year and this year in March. So that's the earliest. And this year it was March 22nd. So we are weeks ahead by other historically.
So Kathy, do you think if someone went to a sunny, sandy prairie spot this weekend, they might get a
Oh,
chance?
they'll still be blooming. They'll still be
Okay.
blooming. And this, they won't even be on to seeds. They're a little bit like deer candy, as I say. So the deer can come through and nip them off so that sometimes you don't see seed production in certain areas.
Okay.
But no, they'll go on. And another prairie that I go to out in the country, in an area that was new to me, River Terrace Prairie Scientific and Natural Area. It's in near Cannon Falls, and it's that was still blooming in May last year, way into end of May. I mean, like 30th of May or something. So they have quite a long season. So just because I saw them 2 weeks ago doesn't mean they're just really going to be coming on for a few more weeks.
Okay, so we haven't missed our chance to see them.
Nope, not at all. I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah.
All right, so next we have the marsh marigold, and some of you may have heard this one called cowslip is the other common name. And the fun story I've heard about that is this plant tends to grow in wetter areas, and so cows would slip on them as they would go down to the ponds to drink. Whether there's truth behind that, I'm not sure, but that is the story that I have heard. And so again, this is the marsh marigold. Marigold, as far as I know, is actually an Anglo-Saxon derivative meaning marsh gold. So kind of a redundant name. But for those of you who have grown marigolds in the past, you might actually spot that this is not actually a marigold. It's, I believe it's in the buttercup family. So all kinds of interesting elements of this name here. But this is, we can go to the next slide. This is one that's actually very common in kind of wetter areas. You can see kind of that slice of the picture on the right is kind of the habitat I see it in the most, right on kind of that lake edge or on the edge of the stream. I've seen this one anywhere from, I would say, early May. I've never seen it in April. Honestly, I don't spend much time in the southern parts of the state around anywhere you would see it. But I've seen this one in Washington County in early May, and I've seen it all the way up through early June. St. Croix State Park is another great spot to see some of these flowers, and I've seen just an enormous amount of these in St. Croix State Park in early June. So again, would be considered a spring ephemeral, but depending on where you're at in the state, you might be able to see it in a couple different areas. Lake Keewatin is another good spot. Actually, now that I think about it, I'm not sure there's any good public access, but Shields Lake in Forest Lake or Lake Keewatin in Washington County are both spots I've seen these in May. Those are all good spots.
I spotted this one in Wild River State Park on the northern entrance late last April.
Yep, so there you go. Just a couple of really nice spots just north of the city, so you're able to see this.
Yep.
And this year they're currently blooming already in
Really?
Minnesota River Valley. Yes, that shows you how early it is. Very unusual.
And that would be another great example of that habitat. You're really looking for that intersection of a woodland edge with a wet area, whether that's an actual wetland, some sort of seep. You'll kind of notice some of the common elements for a lot of these plants. And that's kind of where you would look for them. All right, Meredith, on to the next one.
Yeah.
Okay, so Spring Beauty is a favorite of mine. You can see that it's this lovely pink color with the darker pink veins. And then the end of the stamens are actually pink also. So it's just a stunningly attractive, tiny little plant. You can see that the leaves are very narrow, smooth, and they're opposite. So they it's very distinct identifying the leaves and the flowers. I see these, my real go-to place for most spring ephemerals is the Cannon Valley Trail or any area in the Cannon River Valley. And so usually think about the Cannon River Trail, it's a paved biking or walking trail that goes from Cannon Falls to Red Wing. Let's see, what else do I have here? So it's that little pink flower is only about a ½ inch across. So it's a tiny little thing. It has 5 petals, as you can see. And I think if you look closely, you can see that like I said, the end of the stamens are also pink. And an odd feature is that they actually close up and at night, and they kind of nod over. The little bud nods over and is almost hidden. And even on a cloudy day, they're not going to be open for you. So you have to be out on a sunny day to see spring beauty. They grow in moist woods quite widely. Now, on the right side of the picture, that's actually a hepatica. So that is not, maybe I sent it to you incorrectly.
That was probably me.
No problem. But while we've got it up, unless are you willing to go back to this picture if I need it?
Yeah, we can go. Yeah,
okay,
we can.
All right. So anyway, spring beauty is just a delight to see. I hope that all of you can find it someplace.
And wild geranium is a good one to follow spring beauty because the flowers themselves kind of have some similarities. And so you really have to look at the leaves are radically different. The plant construct itself is really different. And you'll actually really easily notice this. Once you get an eye for it, you'll really notice this one even before it blooms. This would be one that, again, I grew up by Nurse Strand, so this is a one that's really easy to see in the Nurse Strand Big Woods State Park. And again, I feel like that area is a little bit behind similar parts of the state. So I start looking for that one in May, honestly, right around Mother's Day is usually when I start to see that one bloom. But it's something that you can definitely see blooming in April, May, and even as late as into June, depending where you are. So and as Kathy's mentioned, with the weird early season we've had, it's definitely something you could be seeing now, especially with all this rain. So it's a great, perfect. So it's very common in shaded, partly shaded woodlands along paths, edges. It loves kind of that broadleaf forest habitat. So the Big Woods State Park, that Cannon Valley Trail that Kathy mentioned would be another great spot. And it does like that partial sun, which is great for trails that you might be walking along. And you'll see it does form those really thick bunches again. So you'll often see just a whole bunch of them formed in with each other. And honestly, this is another one that's become pretty popular for gardening as well, especially amongst folks who are trying to do kind of pollinator habitats or native plantings. This is one that you can really easily, of course, don't get them from the wild, get them from your local supplier. But I personally have this planted in a couple spots. If you can use hostas somewhere, you can use geranium somewhere. I love this as kind of a native replacement for kind of that spring color. And kind of another interesting feature of this one is I didn't get any, I guess, Meredith, would you mind going back one?
Yeah.
So you can't quite see them. This one's too young. As the seed pods on this dry, after it's pollinated, after those seeds start to form more later in the fall, there's actually a drying process where those seed pods are kind of locked in a rigid area, but as they dry, they snap. And that snapping basically catapults these seeds into another area. So that's just kind of an interesting feature of this particular plant is they're capable of throwing their seeds around, which is not something that very many plants are able to do. And just a couple of questions. I see a question in the chat. I see 2 questions in the chat. One about the skunk cabbage. I believe you could probably see skunk cabbage right now. Like I said, I'm in Minneapolis. Last week I saw it. I wouldn't be surprised if it's there if it's still there. But if you are anywhere north of the cities, I would say even, I would say like Chisago County for sure, you're probably able to find some skunk cabbage still. And wild geranium, it does spread pretty easily from what I can tell. I've had it planted for I think maybe 2 or 3 years, and they are perennials. And what they say about perennials is kind of what is it? The sleep, creep, and leap. So they sleep the first year, they creep the second year, and then the third year you really get that leap. And so the ones I planted 3 years ago are really quite large at this point. And I haven't noticed them kind of spreading yet, but if you go on any of these trails and take a walk and see some, you'll see that they seem to have spread pretty well in the wild.
Okay.
Back to the skunk cabbage, you have not missed it for this year. The brownish maroon spathe was evident on Sunday in the Minnesota River Valley, and the leaves were maybe 6 or 8 inches tall, the green leaves. So they're starting to emerge. So you can see the whole process occurring right now and for the next couple of weeks, I would say. So here we are moving on to hepatica. It gets its name from the leaves have 3 lobes, and here the leaves are hidden. That's why I'm going to want to go back to the previous picture. And our livers have 3 lobes. So the leaves that you see in spring could be mixed in here with the tree leaves because they're either brown or mottled or sort of burgundy colored. And if you just brushed away those leaves, you'd see these last year's leaves. They're still in the ground, but they're not really alive. And you get these on these very dainty but hairy stems come these beautiful, delicate flowers with anywhere from 5 to 12 petals. So they vary quite a bit on how full the flower is. And they are anywhere from white to these light pinkish, light blue into some rather intense blue violet colors. So you don't see as many that are this color as you do the lighter shades. And if you look off to the slightly upper left, about 10 o'clock, I can see some leaves off on the edge of this picture. So and then there's one down at about 4 o'clock. It's brownish, mottled, but they're all hidden in with, I haven't taken pictures thinking I was ever going to be trying to tell somebody about the plant specifically and needing the leaves of the plant. And because they grow on these very, kind of long and very dainty stems, they often will kind of drift off to one side. And then as the flowers are finishing their bloom and starting their seed production, that's when this year's leaves will start emerging. They'll be dark green. They'll have 3 lobes. Sometimes they're more pointed, so they're called sharp lobe. Sometimes they're very rounded, so they're round lobed. Those 2 species overlap completely where I see them. And then those leaves are what is important to provide the energy for seed production and the survival of the plant, so it can come up next spring and bloom again. So this would be a true ephemeral because it's in these moist woods, almost always on a slope. And again, I love to see this at the Cannon Valley Trail, or last year I hadn't been to Cicada Lake State Park for probably a few decades, and all of these flowers, I think except pasqueflower, are there and just very prolific in Cicada Lake State Park. It's probably 10 miles approximately off of 35 on Highway 60. So it's west of Faribault. Anyway, so that's worth a stop also, if you like to go out and hike in the woods. So I think that covers it.
Okay.
All right, on to bloodroot. And I do see a question in the chat about whether geraniums are ephemerals or not. And that's a really good question. Basically, with the definition of ephemerals that we're using, we're establishing kind of the spectrum of ephemerals. So on one side, you have something like the pasque flower, which would be really quickly outcompeted by even just the grasses that it's growing by. But it's able to flower so early that it's able to kind of, it has that niche to it. Again, with something like the dwarf trout lily, it's in and out really, really quick in the season before leaves have really started to close that canopy. The wild geranium definitely has a little higher shade tolerance than some of the other ones we've talked about. But like I said, I think it would be on that spectrum of being an ephemeral. It certainly would not be a flowering plant that you would see in the summer, and you would likely miss it, especially in July and August. You would likely not know that it was there, as it's kind of over sheltered by the closing tree canopy, as well as the other plants that are kind of entering that area. So bloodroot is one that I always liked finding as a kid because, of course, it's got a very kind of unique feature, which is a blood red juice that comes from the leaves and stem. Kind of like milkweed, which has its signature white juice. As kids, we were always really excited to find something like this. I now know that juice is toxic, so avoid getting it on your skin, especially in concentrations. So, but it's still a very interesting plant. You'll often find it in kind of, again, that full or partly shaded element of a woodland. Oftentimes you'll want to be looking for more undisturbed sites. So an area of the woods that is not really seeing a lot of activity. A lot of parks are really good at kind of confining human activity to a trail. So I've seen this a lot at the Big Wood State Park. I've also even seen it at Lebanon Hills. They're doing a lot of really good savanna restorations. So you're unlikely to see this in their savanna restoration areas. But anywhere that's more of like a maple, what we would call like a maple basswood, or like an eastern broadleaf forest, that's where you're going to kind of see something more like this. I did see this. I'm trying to remember. I want to say is it Jay Cook State Park that's just south of Duluth?
Yep.
I saw this one last summer, pretty late in the season. I would again say maybe late May or early June, just to kind of show you the scope of when you could see some of these things. But I would start looking for it this week, even in kind of those more southern areas, whether that's.
This is the one that our ecologist saw today at Valley
Yep.
Park in Mendota
Yep.
Heights. So
Yep. There you go.
under
Another
the
good
power line.
Yep, exactly. Which actually I wonder if that was a disturbed or an undisturbed, how recently disturbed that area might have been, because that might conflict my information.
I know we disturbed it pretty well a year ago. But it is growing where last year there was ragweed taller than my head. You can't see it. I'm only, so it was like 6 foot tall ragweed. We took that out and it's in that open space now.
Sure. So that probably gave this plant an opportunity that it's been waiting for.
Yeah, it's probably been hiding out for years.
Yep. And as Meredith said, if it was seen this week, this plant only flowers for a very short amount of time. Basically, after it's pollinated, it will lose its flowers within 2 or 3 days max after pollination. So you kind of have a short window. However, it does form, again, these really thick colonies that will all kind of bloom at different times, depending where they're at, what the conditions are. So you have a good window of time to see it, but each individual plant will only bloom for maybe 2 or 3 days. And kind of another interesting element of this plant is they're in a category of plants that their seeds are dispersed primarily by insects. So it's not necessarily what you or I would consider a fruit, but their seeds contain an element that is particularly attractive to ants in this case. So the ants will pick up these seeds, bring them back to their colonies, scoop off I believe it's called an aleosome, which is this fruity part, feed that fruity part to the ants or the larva, and then throw out the rest, which just happens to be the part of the plant that will then bloom or will then germinate. So that's just one of the ways that this pretty interesting, unique plant finds is able to get itself spread around the state.
So for other bloodroot sightings, it's here in the metro. It was emerging in southwest Minneapolis, and it was spotted at Central Park in Bloomington along 9 Mile Creek last Saturday.
Mhm.
So this is one
And-
that
Yep.
we could get out and see.
Mhm.
And I'd point out in that right picture, you see a good shot of most of a shot of a leaf. This is one that has fairly distinctive leaves as well. So even if you're not seeing that flower yet, you can certainly take a look at those leaves and maybe make a mental note to come back, or you might have missed it.
And in the Chanhassen Nature Preserve. So feel free to jump in the chat if you have a spot to recommend for any of these ephemerals. I'm trying to collect them so I can share it with everyone.
So the last flower I chose is Dutchman's breeches. And you can see this foliage is this very lacy, divided leaf. And then it gets its name because the very irregular flower is like little pantaloons inflated, and they're sort of like hanging from the ankles upside down. And they are on these very arching stems, could be up to 14 flowers per stem. It's a very, I think, graceful looking plant. And again, I see it in very great proliferation along the Cannon Valley Trail last year, and Cicada Lake State Park, any of those maple basswood kind of woods that are deep, moist, and they're all growing in the same area with hepatica, etc. This plant has a very closely related relative with this same foliage that crosses over in southeastern Minnesota. And it's really, it's called squirrel corn is its common name. And it's just really a little tiny bleeding heart. But at a first glance, because the foliage takes your attention, you could think it was Dutchman's breeches. And then you look more closely and you realize, it's really a little white heart on those stems. And so that's a different plant, but it's closely related. The tuberous roots are actually can be poisonous to some animals because they have alkaloids in them. And again, I would say go to the Cannon Valley Trail or some other, I know you can find it along the, I saw the plants, but not blooming in the Minnesota River Valley from out going west from Old Cedar Avenue trailhead. So there's a lot of places that you can find these that are close at hand.
Yeah, and Anna dropped into the chat that there's a presentation for Dutchman's breeches along the woodland path at the Arboretum.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and I get to wrap it up. So this is one of my favorites too. They're all my favorites, but this is another one. This is the large flowered trillium. So when a lot of folks think of a classic ephemeral, Minnesota woodland wildflower, this is what they have in mind. And I'm going to kind of lump snow trillium would be another one you might think of that looks similar. And these are very aptly named flowers. So the large flowered trillium, in Latin, the Trillium grandiflorum, literally translates as the big flowered trillium. And it's the biggest one that you'll see. If you see a snow trillium, you'll know it's a snow trillium because it's not as big as a big trillium. And also it'll be more likely to be growing oftentimes when there's still snow on the ground. So snow trillium is earlier in the year and smaller. The other trillium, was it was it large flower trillium? I'm getting my Latin
Yes.
all mixed up. By large flowered trillium. Some people also call it white trillium, which is why I was momentarily confused. Lots of common names for all of these things. So large flowered trillium as well will obviously be the larger one. They are both white, but you can see it's got kind of that signature 3-petaled flower there as well. And this is actually going to be another one. Again, you're going to find it in what would be kind of not necessarily a wet woodland. In fact, the areas that I can recall seeing it tend to be more of like an upland area, but still just kind of a rich area, a rich woodland. I've seen it in everything from like a maple basswood forest in kind of the southern part of the state, like the Nursery Bigwood State Park, or the Riverbend Nature Center in Faribault is one of my favorite spots to see this. And then again, I've seen it all the way up until June in the northern area, well, north of the metro, I should say, up in St. Croix State Park, where I've seen it in kind of an aspen, mixed aspen woodland. But this would be another one that's actually, the seeds are dispersed by insects, again, just like the bloodroots. Although the seeds for this one will also be dispersed not just by ants, but occasionally by harvestmen, which some of you may call or I honestly call the daddy longlegs that are not actually spiders but look like spiders. So the daddy longlegs, even some wasps are thought to carry the seeds for this one around. And that's how you get like a really diverse colony, like you can see in kind of that picture on the left. And again, they do prefer the shade. I see them in kind of, again, that shade edge of the forest right along where a path would conveniently be. And another interesting feature of this plant is it's hard to believe when you look at a big colony like that, but they are a very slow growing plant. So from the time that an ant takes that seed, eats off that sugary part and leaves it, it can take up to 7 years, maybe up to 10 years for that particular seed to grow into an actual flowering plant. And so because of that, it's very important that we leave these spots kind of undisturbed. There's been issues in the past with these areas being harvested for wildflowers that can then be sold at like a landscape store, but it takes a very long time and has to be a relatively undisturbed habitat for these flowers to grow there. But yeah, like I said, definitely viewable now. Let me just take a look at the chat here. Yeah, I would not be surprised if some of these are showing up now, either kind of in the southern areas. In the metro, I would anticipate it within the next couple weeks. But then if you miss the window down here, like I said, I saw them up at St. Croix State Park last year, as late as I would say June 1st or 2nd.
And I let Aiden and Kathy only pick their top 5 to share tonight, but the love continues. So Kathy shared other common early flowers that you might spot. So
when you're out seeing the ones that we've talked about in these areas that are the lush woods, if you're really into learning more plant names, then these are some of the ones that will be blooming at the same time. And particularly the 3 anemones, rue, wood, and false rue anemone, that really overlap with hepatica specifically. I mean, the leaves are very different, but you will be seeing these things at the same time. And if you want to learn more, these might be a few to pay attention to and look up on Minnesota wildflower website or whatever source you use. I think somebody put in the chat, and I had thought of mentioning this, Eloise Butler Wildflower Garden in Minneapolis is an excellent place to see most of these, and they will be labeled. So if anybody is uncertain, we may have a lot of people that know wildflowers, or we may have a lot of people who are interested in learning the names of wildflowers.
So I collected a lot of the ones that you guys just mentioned during this presentation, but these were ones that I compiled, in Theodore Wirth Park was at the top of my list. And I will admit that Anne Godfrey, who shared that, is also my mother. So I've been trained well to know where to look for these. So we can go back to the prairie ones that were on that other side. But so this is where to see them. But a question like if you wanted to go out now that you've learned more about these, if you guys had to say like the second week of April after rain, where should a person go on a hike if they wanted to look for these? We have this list here where people could explore, but like, are we like, is it more like Southern Metro right now, like Bloomington, Egan, or even further south, Northfield?
Well, I
That's what-
haven't,
Oh,
Go
go
ahead,
for it.
Kathy.
Aiden.
go ahead, Aiden, go ahead.
That would be my instinct. I have not been able to roam as much as I would have liked this spring. So hence, right, this spring I've basically only been to Minnehaha Falls, and that's where I saw that skunk cabbage. But I saw, like I said in the chat, other folks seeing some of those wildflowers in the metro. In the metro, because we tend to be, we've got that urban heat island effect, so we tend to warm up a little faster. So we're kind of comparable to southern areas of the state. So I would not be surprised if you could go see some of these things, in kind of that southern area. Down to the Iowa border, you might be too late. But, Faribault, that Cannon Valley Trail that Kathy mentioned would definitely be a good spot. And another thing that I want to point out that Kathy has been mentioning is that she's been mentioning the aspect, the side of the slope that she has mentioned a number of times. And that's actually really important as well. So just depending on when a lot of the bud, or excuse me, a lot of the germinating for these plants is tied to soil temperature rather than the amount of sunlight they're getting. So once that soil warms up, they'll start going. They'll start, the sugars will start being processed. They'll start putting up their shoots and their flowers. So those southern sides of the slope would be a good spot to focus on as well.
Are there other things like, oh, sorry, Kathy, you can go.
No, well, I was just going to say, as soon as it stops raining in Minnesota, if I were home, I'd be running down to the Cannon Valley Trail, but I'm going to be gone for a week because it's in such an exceptionally early year. Usually it's the last week of April at the earliest. But don't panic about any of these things. There's because reinforcing what Aiden just said, that it's soil temperature and the exact exposure. And now leaves are going to come out on the trees in Minnesota already. They're starting. The fringe is starting, and all of these things have a several-week window, no matter where you're finding them. So, but this year you would want to go pretty soon to start seeing them.
And then my follow-up question, like you talked about the soil temperature makes a difference. So is there a way to like say, like, if we've had 3 60-degree days in a row, the temperature is this, like, so therefore it's a good time to go out and look? Or, I mean, we could all go out and look even if they're not there, but is there a way to like hedge your bet to know you might spot something?
Let me see. Well, for this specific year, we've had 2 days in the 80s and we've had many days in the 70s. And that's why it is so, and no snow on the ground for a very long time now already. It was gone early. So that's why things are so early, I think. So I don't know how to answer that. I just have probably a sense of it each spring of when I go and look. And I'm going to just say, if you can bike on the Cannon Valley Trail. And if you want to do it as a hiking thing, which is what I've been doing in more recent years, I suggest starting in Welch, because the trail is, 20 miles or 22 miles long or something, Cannon Falls to Red Wing. Start in Welch and walk toward Red Wing. And in about maybe a mile and a half or so is where it gets really intense with a lot of the flowers we've talked about. So in a 3-4 mile walk, if that's all you want to do, you can have a lot of flowers.
Very good.
I think that's fantastic advice. The only thing I would add to that is, like Kathy said, this has been really weird weather. We will probably get another snowstorm the way our seasons go. It's just really hard to know. So my advice is to find a hike that you don't care what you find on it. So long, and
Yes.
then just see what you see on the walk. If you don't see one of these flowers, you're very likely to see another this time of year, or you might be lucky and just see an enormous variety of them. So just pick a walk, pick a hike, or pick an excursion where you're just happy. You're just happy to be there, just happy to be out. But then keep your eyes open, and you might notice some of these things. That's how I first started noticing them. I'd just be going on a walk and think, what are all of these enormous three-petaled flowers around? And then me being myself, I had to look it up and find out what they are. And then one
Yeah.
thing leads to another. And
And I'll-
I just want to,
Oh, I
I
was
just
just gonna
want to,
say, I was gonna add to, if you're walking, you don't know what they are. I used to carry a wildflower identification book with me, but now there's a fancy app, iNaturalist in the Seek or a Seek, and you can you can load a picture in and it'll help you identify what it is you're seeing. So that's a handy tool in your pocket with our smartphones these days.
the only thing I had wanted to say is there was a question in the chat about if I wanted to plant Trillium, where should I purchase? I don't want to make it sound like there's a conspiracy taking, Trillium out of woodlands and into your garden. I know that is a thing that happens. It's a thing that should not happen. But I would suspect that like most respectable retailers generally are doing their due diligence. So I'm not sure how much promotion we're supposed to do here. But I can tell you,
If
I
you,
shop at Mother Earth Gardens, which is just my local flower shop, and I trust them to kind of do their good work. And so I wouldn't be too concerned about that. If you're buying it off of Craigslist, I'd be a little skeptical. But beyond that, I don't think it's much of a worry.
And I would reinforce what Aidan said, just go to some state park or Three Rivers Park that you want to take a walk in that's wooded. Usually these are in the woods, and find them and see what you see. And I think that's the right attitude. And I have a great affection for the Cannon Valley Trail because for many, 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 many years, I would take a few close friends and we would bike. We'd do some on the county roads and then bike on the Cannon Valley Trail. And that's when I realized how dense it is. And then a few years ago, because there's too many places to go, I wanted to go to multiple areas in one day or something. So then I figured out where I could hike from to get the biggest bang for my buck, get in and out and just have the best time, but then maybe go on to the River Terrace, Prairie SNA or another spot that I like and just make some kind of a big loop. So I'm kind of a crazed person when it comes to these early wildflowers or any wildflowers.
So Kathy, the Cannon Valley Trail, is it an official bike path that you can walk, or is it like if you're looking to find it, it's the Cannon Valley Bike Trail?
Yes, it's
trying to Google
Cannon
it.
Valley. It's a private citizen group. So there is a $5 wheelage fee per day or an annual pass, but walkers don't have to pay. I wouldn't go on the weekend. I would only go midweek. So if people were still working, that's not very practical advice then, unless they can get away, because there will be too many bikers and families will be out with buggers and kids and all that on the, bike trail. To do it with a bike, then you've got the bike and there's not really any good place to set it down. So you can just really take pictures or do something like that. There's certain spots that have become posted by private landowners. So of course, do not trespass. They're well posted, but there's no need to trespass because there's so much variety and there's so many places.
Right. Does anyone ever have any other questions for Kathy or Aidan or the group? There are people that are spotting these other places. So we'll open it up. If anyone has a question, you can ask away. No? All right. With that, I think we'll wrap it up. So thanks everyone. And I will share this recording and send it out to everyone. And along with all the places that they mentioned that you might be able to spot these so we can get out and explore. Thanks everybody.
Thanks, Meredith.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.